Like many fans of cinema, I've seen a lot of flicks. In my case, horror films. I've seen the great classics that have helped shape the genre and its subgenres. I've also seen some of the worst of the worst. Movies with awful acting, terrible dialogue,
Garbage Day!
and even more awful effects. But despite how bad some of these films are, they all had something in common: craft. Being a VHS collector, I've scraped the bottom of the barrel and discovered that, although these films don't have the hot Hollywood starlets or the large car explosions that the higher budgeted studio films had, and still have, they did have craft. Some of them were shot on film by part-time directors looking to cash in on a craze, while others were true film nerds who wanted to make their own movies but didn't have the budget or means to shoot on film. The circumstances were usually the same. Some amateur director somewhere decided to fulfill his fantasies by buying a video camcorder and making the best damn film with what he's got. They would set up the shots, do the makeup effects, and edit their film all on their own. For example, John McBride's 1988 shot-on-video classic Cannibal Campout wasn't only directed by him, but he also played a lead role in the film, created the music, even sang a theme song, and edited the film. Yet when compared to most films making it mainstream in the cinema chains today, and even then, Cannibal Campout is still considered awful trash cinema made by a wannabe Hollywood director. But somehow, films like Paranormal Activity make box office records. A film that required nothing more than a few desperate actors, a camcorder on a tripod, and a string tied to a doorknob. Why is this? Here, I hope to explore the question as to why these films are popular, and how they're destroying the horror genre by lowering the standard. I will also delve into the history of the found footage category and expose the marketing gimmicks that made them successful.
Okay, I got it working now.
Found footage films work under the pretense that the story is real, as told by allegedly discovered evidence, in this case, camcorder footage. The intent of the filmmakers is to imitate the same sense of reality that actual footage imposes on us. Before the popularity of these films, most handheld or shaky camera footage we saw was of actual true events, news coverage of disasters, personal home movies, surveillance footage, etc. They didn't have the steady tracking shots, the precise editing, or the clever lighting that we would see in a typical film. The creator of these new found footage films take advantage of this and create content that gives the illusion of reality.
I want to be very clear about this. What you're about to see is not a movie, okay? This has been assembled from some 76 plus hours of raw mini DV source footage. Not a frame of this has been doctored. It hasn't been manipulated in any way. This is just raw footage. It's been edited strictly for time.
Our minds have been so conditioned to believe that handheld, homemade footage is real that whenever we see it, we want to believe it, even when it's manufactured, as it is today. According to Wikipedia, a found footage film is a film in which a substantial part is presented as discovered film or video recordings. Using this definition and trying to understand this genre, I've come up with two kinds of found footage films. The found raw footage. Oftentimes, the film is composed entirely of shaky camcorder footage. The footage may or may not have been recorded for a documentary, but because of the extremely poor production value, and that the footage is mostly raw, it's not in the traditional format of a documentary. Because there isn't any narration or commentary accompanying the footage, these type of films often give the impression that the tapes are ripped right from the camcorder. Examples include The Blair Witch Project and Paranormal Activity. The simulated documentary has interviews, competent editing, and the characters often acknowledge the camera, with the understanding that a documentary is being made.
I'm not comfortable with a statement confirming or denying the possibility that the McPhersons were abducted by extraterrestrials. A deputy found the tape at the McPherson place, and the McPhersons haven't been heard from since. Now, beyond that, I have no comment.
It might be easier to understand this category as an edited form of the found raw footage. Examples include The Last Broadcast and Alien Abduction, the incident in Lake County. Film, of course, was not the first to use the illusion of recorded events for a realistic effect. The epistolary novel uses a series of journal entries, letters, and other documents to tell a story. These novels date back as far as the 16th century. But one of the most infamous ones, and more relevant to this discussion, is Bram Stoker's Dracula. The story is told in a series of journal entries, letters, shipping logs, and other documents. It almost feels as if the documents were pieced together from an evidence folder to tell a story. Even during the time of the novel, the effect worked, with some readers buying vampire kits to help them sleep at night. But aesthetically, this device doesn't transfer over well to film. Writers had to be skilled enough to write from different personalities and angles. In many ways, skill-wise, the epistolary novel wasn't too different than any other novel, other than the structure. Found footage films, on the other hand, require almost no filmmaking skill, since it's the inept appearance that creates the effect. But more on this later.
Ladies and gentlemen, here I am, back of a stone wall that adjoins Mr. Wilmer's garden. What's that? There's a jet of flame springing from the mirror that leaps right at the advancing men. It strikes them head on. Lord, they're turning into flames. The whole field's caught up by the woods, the fires, the gas tanks of the automobiles spreading everywhere.
On October 30th, 1934, Orson Welles makes history with his infamous radio drama, War of the Worlds. Its format was as a simulated news broadcast. Many listeners who had tuned in after the broadcast had already begun thought the live news coverage was absolutely authentic. Although it has been debated whether the show truly caused any sort of panic, some people believe their country was being attacked, if not by aliens, then by the Germans.
Do you think, Mr. Wells, that you might have taken unfair advantage of the public in using a method of conveyance for authentic news?
I don't believe that I have, since it is not a method original with me.
This radio show would later become a stepping stone towards the found footage film genre. Usually, Cannibal Holocaust is considered the first film of this kind, and it truly is, but there's another film that predates Cannibal Holocaust that I believe played an important role in forming this new category of film, Faces of Death. Under the commission of a Japanese company in 1978, John Alan Schwartz was asked to make a film exploring death. He and his crew scoured news agencies across the globe for harsh footage depicting accidents, murders, and other similar content. After all the footage was edited together, Faces of Death was born. Upon screening a rough version of the film to the Japanese producers, they requested more footage of death in process, rather than footage of the mere aftermath. Their only option at the time was to recreate portions of the accidents.
The reason audiences were so convinced by Faces of Death was its clever use of real and mocked-up clips, all shot on the same cheap cameras available to any member of the public.
For decades following the film's release, people believed that everything in this shockumentary was real. The context surrounding the footage was so authentic that people believed it. Faces of Death isn't a masterpiece by any means, but to me, it remains an interesting experimental film, combining true and recreated events in very creative ways. Cannibal Holocaust is considered by many who know their cinema as the first found footage film. and it's true in the strictest sense. People will either love this film or hate it, but this is not a discussion on whether Cannibal Holocaust is a great film or not, but rather how it's the only found footage film with the most filmmaking competence. Cannibal Holocaust was directed by Ruggero Deodato in 1980. The reason people call this a found footage film is due to a huge portion of the film being the footage Professor Monroe recovers from the Amazon jungle while looking for the lost filmmakers. But what makes this film different than the more common found footage films we see today is that the footage is used as a device, rather than taking up the entire film. There's an actual framework built around the found footage. Deodato didn't rely on the ease of shaky handheld camera footage for the entire duration of the film, but rather executed filmmaking competence where he saw fit. It was important that the film look completely real. He had actual animals killed on film and requested that the actors stay off radar for a year to create the illusion that they were actually killed for the film. We would later see the Blair Witch Project do the same thing 20 years later. Although the scenes surrounding the screening of the found footage were created in the usual cinematic sense and controlled environments, reminding us that we're only watching a movie, some still believe the found footage portions of the film. So much so that Ruggero Deodato was arrested on charges of obscenity and murder. Italian authorities demanded that the actors come into court and prove they were in fact alive.
I originally had a contract with the actors where they were asked to disappear for a year. But when I was in court on murder charges and things were going really badly, I had to bring one of them back to testify.
This is a testament to the genius of Deodato in executing this gimmick, while also making a good film technically and fooling the world to believe what they were seeing was real.
Slate Start, 1 August 69, Daspo documentary, lessons learned team, officer in charge, Lieutenant Art Drury, cameraman, inspector.
9 years following the release of Cannibal Holocaust, we finally see another found footage film, predating the Blair Witch Project by a decade, the 1989 Vietnam War epic, 84 Charlie Mopic. The film revolves around a soldier in an army unit shooting footage for a documentary. He follows the unit through the Vietnam jungles as they try to survive and maintain their sanity. Although the film is no masterpiece by the very nature of which it was made, you do get the sense that the filmmakers treated the topic with care. The premise is entirely believable. They really did have soldiers in combat filming this stuff. The found footage was used as a device rather than a cheap and easy gimmick. The same year 84 Charlie Mopic was released, we would have the first raw found footage horror film. In 1988, Dean Aliato was looking to make the most authentic portrayal of an alien abduction ever seen. According to Aliato, the best part of the idea was that it could be done for my minuscule budget. He hired a few actors, a props guy to build a spacecraft, and ran around with a camcorder. Once completed, the video would never be distributed properly due to setbacks with the distributor, but it would eventually become a legendary tape amongst the UFO community, many believing it was absolutely real. Despite interviews with the director revealing the truth that it was made by himself without actual aliens, some UFO believers maintain that the lost video is, in fact, an authentic alien abduction. Some believe Aliato's confession is part of an elaborate cover-up by the US government.
Parce que tu dois savoir que quand tu immerges un corps dans l'eau, il se gonfle d'air, hein, tu vois, et alors il a tendance à remonter à la surface. Donc tu es obligé de le lester afin qu'il coule, hein. Donc tu le lestes avec des cailloux, des choses un peu lourdes.
In 1993, the simulated documentary Man Bites Dog is released. The film is intended to be a document of the day-to-day life of a serial killer. The film would go on to gain cult status. As the first simulated documentary-type found footage film, it does exhibit some production value, despite my disliking for the film. Fast forward to 1998. Remember that raw found footage film?
Mom, if there's more of those things out there, we don't need to have Michelle get kidnapped or something.
Through a series of connections, Dick Clark Productions ends up producing a remake of the original video to be aired on the TV network UPN in 1998. At this time, there was a newfound interest in UFOs with the rising popularity of the X-Files TV show and the mass suicide of the UFO cult Heaven's Gate in 1997. The network took the new footage that Aliato shot and recut it to include interviews in an attempt to make the film appear more like a documentary and less like some guy running around with a camcorder.
The home video you are about to see documents an alleged case of alien abduction. A family from Lake County, Minnesota was reported missing by relatives on Thanksgiving weekend.
The remake debuted on television in January of 1998. Although Aliato claims the film was a hit on television based on website traffic during the airing of the movie, it never really amounted to anything more than a niche hit amongst UFO believers.
These people are genuinely terrified, and the aliens are not coming down a ramp saying, E.T. phone home. The second reason I find this unnerving is that if it is a hoax, I should have been the one that directed it.
Following the success of the Blair Witch Project in 1999, self-proclaimed horror fans popped out of the woodworks to claim that another film had the idea first. The Last Broadcast, released in 1998, is certainly not a raw found footage film, but rather a simulated documentary that includes footage found in the woods, similar to Cannibal Holocaust and the Blair Witch Project. But what makes The Last Broadcast so different than Blair Witch is that it did have actual production value. It had professional interviews, intelligent editing, props, and a direction. It wasn't just a bunch of kids running around in the woods with a camcorder as we see in the Blair Witch. Granted, I didn't like The Last Broadcast very much, but at the very least, he used the found footage technique in a creative way. It's clear many hours had went into the film, and in this sense, I respect The Last Broadcast despite not being a fan, especially when you consider the atrocity that would be unleashed upon the world a year later. Up until this point, almost all of the found footage films made were simulated documentaries, with instances of found footage. But now comes along the Blair Witch Project in 1999. Although I never saw the film at the time of its release, I would later mature as a film lover, and after finally seeing the film, it left me scratching my head. Really? I thought to myself. The film gave me the impression that it was a gimmick used by amateur filmmakers who couldn't get noticed because they couldn't make a real film.
Okay, we don't want to fuck up the cameras before we leave.
Even after watching the film again recently, I believe this is more true than ever. The plot is simple. A pretentious filmmaker and her friends go into the woods to trace the Blair Witch legend. What we see are a few interviews with locals about the legend, food shopping, and then about an hour or so of them stumbling around in the woods. They see stick figures in the trees, they hear some scary noises, and eventually wind up in a rundown house with some guy standing in the corner. That's it. The film uses all of its shortcomings to its advantage. No body actors.
Think of the joy of being in a really good film.
Incompetent camera work, and production mistakes that make the film stronger. Because of the style of this film, nearly anything could go wrong and work to create the authentic feel. Several times throughout the commentary, the director will point out a mistake and then in the same breath admire it because it worked for the film.
You can see it's out of focus because Joshua actually had this set on meters. The camera lens was set on meters, the depth of field was off, so he was shooting everything out of focus a little bit, which, you know, is a technical flaw, but it ends up working for the scene and kind of exemplifying, you know, his inexperience, and then trying to cover it up later on in the following scene. It works really well.
Yeah.
Because of the style of this film, they can get away with saying things like, "It works for the effect of the film," or "Screw it, leave it in," rather than going back to fix it like actual filmmakers. This is what the Blair Witch Project is entirely, making something awful visually and saying,
I meant to do that.
In other words, thinking, we suck at making movies, so let's make an excuse for the sucking. How did this atrocity get into theaters? How was it even successful? Why in the world would critics with strong reputations admire this film? Much of its success could be attributed to clever marketing and the fact that it was different, in the gimmick sense. But different doesn't necessarily make it genius. A big selling point of this movie was that it was authentic footage found in the woods. Much of the audience that went to see the Blair Witch Project did so on the premise that the footage may be real. By our very nature, we all have some degree of morbid curiosity, and that's what the ticket sales of this film thrived on.
I just wanted the website to just kind of be this investigative website that treated this case as if it were real. So it was a great tool for us, and I really don't think the film would have done nearly as much money, as much business as it's done if it weren't for the website.
Many people who say they enjoyed this film do not say it's because of the amazing camera work, but because, as they claim, it was scary. But the scare is not based on anything specific in the film, except maybe some jumps, but rather the false pretense that the footage is real. Ebert was quick to dismiss the Friday the 13th franchise as pitiful attempts at film.
This movie is just more leftover recycled garbage from the last 4 times around.
But will go on the record giving the Blair Witch Project 4 stars, higher than any of the Lord of the Rings films. The Friday the 13th films may not be masterpieces in cinematic art, but they did, however, have one thing: effort. Those films had professional crews working together with the actors. The shots had to be set up correctly, the lighting had to be just right, the blocking had to be timed and precise, the props had to look authentic, so on and so forth. When all was said and done, you had a pretty decent flick, at least in the technical sense. The Blair Witch Project lacked all of this and, at least in my humble opinion, didn't show the least bit of effort. The movie comes off simply as a group of friends partying in the woods while goofing around with a video camcorder they bought from Circuit City.
But he's allowed to fart as much as he wants. Really don't think
Never gave Mike any fart allowance.
In fact, the friends were actually drunk at one point, partying at a motel.
So they're not totally intoxicated yet.
No.
Yeah, but they get pretty wild.
They get pretty.
They took all the money we gave them, basically blew it on booze.
So they're messed up by now.
Yeah, Josh especially is getting messed
pretty
up.
hammered by now.
But it's a great scene because it really
Right off the bat, the commentary starts with one of the producers saying,
Hopefully you guys are not expecting a really serious, insightful comment.
En octubre del 1994, tres estudiantes.
I have to give the guy credit for being honest. How can anyone talk about the making of a movie like this without joking around? Following the success of the Blair Witch Project, naturally, there were tons of similar found footage films. Because these required no real skill, effort, or money, amateurs started making a ton of these. They didn't leave much of an impression in the cinematic world. They were merely an attempt to garner the same notoriety as the Blair Witch Project, but failed miserably, and thank goodness for that.
How did Blair Witch inspire you, if it even did at all?
Yeah, it actually did a lot. I mean, first of all, I just loved the movie. I thought it was great, and I enjoyed it tremendously.
Fast forward to 2009, Paranormal Activity is released to theaters. Because I don't critique films I haven't seen, I stayed, struggling to stay awake during what must have been the most boring theater experience in my life. Once again, I left scratching my head. Made in 2007 by Oren Peli, the film revolves around a haunted house and the homeowners who catch it on video. Once again, not much to the storyline here. Most of the film consisted of a couple with no chemistry walking around a house. The creepy moments include a door moving on its own, loud sounds, Katie being pulled out of bed, and other nonsense because, as I guess, demons and spirits have nothing better to do.
What was your filmmaking experience before that? I know that you were involved in developing video games and things like that. What about in filmmaking? Have you done anything?
No, this was the first thing I've done. So when I had the idea for Paranormal Activity, and I figured, that's something I can actually just shoot in my house for, very cheaply, and I figured, I can actually do the whole thing without a real crew.
Are you saying there's no script at all to Paranormal Activity?
There is a script, it's not, the dialogue isn't written, there's
It's a structure.
So he didn't have a script, shot it with a crew of 3 others, and used his own home. Paranormal Activity isn't something that hasn't been done before. On YouTube at the time, There were tons of these hoax videos with ghosts, but more importantly, there was the popular TV series Ghost Hunters. All Peli did was very loosely create a narrative with the footage. The success of Paranormal Activity, like the Blair Witch Project, is complex, but once again has to do almost entirely with the marketing. They included a Demanded campaign, which included trailers consisting of a theater audience screaming and jumping while viewing the film.
The only money we really invested into this campaign was setting up our Demanded page.
The Demanded campaign goes to show that the studio didn't believe the film could stand on its own. Often, horror films in theaters are a group experience. When young kids go to see these films, they enjoy them not necessarily because of the movie itself, although the movie may or may not be good, but because they spend that time with friends. Similar to a laugh track on a sitcom, when we hear others around us scream, we want to join in on the fun too. The marketing team for this film knew this, and thus included a bunch of shots of screaming audience members in a theater. What Paranormal Activity does is turn the theater into a haunted house attraction. Most of the scares aren't scares at all, but rather startling and sudden noises that make us jump. Jason Blum, who brought Paranormal Activity to Paramount's attention, even stated that he recognized that Paranormal Activity was a lot like the Blair Witch in the way that it delivered purely on an audience level. Both were designed to be theatrical experiences, felt viscerally by large groups of strangers united in a dark room. I think there's a time and a place for everything, including Paranormal Activity, but placing it in a theater as a film rather than merely an attraction is an insult to actual filmmakers around the world. Except to maybe Steven Spielberg.
The next day, just to make sure they're making the right decision, they had Steven Spielberg watch the movie to give his stamp of approval, and he loved it. The story is that he watched the movie, and I think he watched it in his bedroom, and then like the next day, he tried to get back into his bedroom and it was locked in from the inside.
According to the LA Times, he brought the movie back to DreamWorks in a garbage bag. When this story broke, news agencies began ranting and raving that the film even scared Spielberg. I realize that Spielberg sold his soul a long time ago, but this gimmick is just pathetic.
I think the performances of the three actors are so realistic and convincing, without which the film wouldn't work at all.
The greatest argument I hear for these films are the great actors, that their performances come off so natural and convincing. First, we must understand that they're not interpreting a script, they are improvising. It's much easier for us to have a made-up discussion with someone than to read a script, memorize the lines, and act on it on terms of the director. It shocks me that so many people will give these actors credit when all they're doing is making stuff up on the spot based on a loose outline.
We weren't told much as far as specifics of what we would be doing. It was more just the nature of the filmmaking.
But it was scripted, right? Not like the Blair Witch Project,
Oren had a clear... Go ahead.
It was completely improvised.
Yeah.
If you take a look at the dialogue sequences in the original Paranormal Activity film, you'll notice how cut up they are. If their improv came off so natural to them, Peli wouldn't have to cut the dialogue to shreds. Clearly, they were doing something wrong that Peli was trying to repair.
Sometimes it was a little hard to see how pieces would fit together, and we'd shoot entire arcs, and we'd realize that there was maybe like a logic hole or something that could be stronger, and we'd have to change that on the fly and move with it.
If these actors are so convincing, they were probably swooped up by Hollywood, right?
Well, where's your careers going now?
This movie, I'm so thankful because it's opened up a lot of doors, and we're reading scripts and meeting really good people. We're talking to you. I mean, I think some good things are ahead.
Despite her fame and critics claiming how brilliant of an actress she is, Katie Featherston of Paranormal Activity only has 8 credits as of 2013, most of which are related to Paranormal Activity. Whether as a sequel to the series, as a guest on a late-night TV show to promote the film, or on a TV series produced by Oren Peli, the director of Paranormal Activity.
Steven Spielberg said this about the two of you. They created such a reality that you just sit back and say, well, they're not acting. This is happening. For two actors to make you feel like that, you've got to admire them. Steven Spielberg, on you.
They're so great, Spielberg. I don't see you putting them in any of the films you're involved with. But let's go back even further. Whatever happened to that chick in the Blair Witch Project? Heather Donahue. She did a few small films after, but once her career dried up, she resorted to selling marijuana and writing a book about it. She would later quit the drug dealing business after a friend got busted. Some have called these people geniuses for creating an effective film on a minuscule budget. But a genius at what? Filmmaking? Hopefully not. Hopefully we could agree that running around with a shaky camera is not genius. Geniuses at business, perhaps? Once again, I say no. That title would go to the execs at the studio for using marketing tactics to manipulate people to see these in theaters.
Personally, I think it was someone fucking with your head.
Or maybe these filmmakers are geniuses after all, able to fool the world into believing they made a great film, when all they did was run around with a camcorder they bought from Circuit City.
Basically, it was just us running through trees and going nuts out there in the complete darkness.
Like the director guys, we had him on the show, and we were like, so what did you guys do? They're like, I don't know, we gave them cameras, we let them go in the woods for 2 weeks, and now we're millionaires. Like, they didn't even do anything.
Immediately after the success of the Blair Witch Project, Eduardo Sanchez and Daniel Myrick were both offered a chance to direct an actual movie, The Exorcist prequel. Sanchez states, "We weren't ready for that, man. We would have been chewed up." Suffice it to say, they too knew they weren't the geniuses they were made out to be, terrified at the first chance to make a real movie. Oren Peli is one of the few that actually went on to work on other Hollywood-produced films, but look at them. Many of those are also related to found footage. I think it's rather hilarious that even after Paranormal Activity, he's only directed one other film as of 2013, Area 51, while all of his other credits are as a producer on films like The Bay. Imagine if Oren Peli was asked to make an actual film. Would he do it? So far, the fact that he has mostly been a producer rather than a director speaks volumes.
As a writer, director, producer, what is the job? Which of those is your favorite job per se?
I would say that a director is definitely the most stressful and hard, and I don't know why anyone in their right mind would ever want to direct anything.
But I have to admire his honesty. According to thecollider.com, Peli does not mind seeing other found footage films hit theaters. He recognizes that he did not invent the genre and feels like he was just in the right place at the right time, and that this type of filmmaking was going to hit the mainstream sooner or later because of the influence of reality TV and YouTube. In many cases, I actually don't think we deserve that much credit or blame, depending on your point of view. I feel like it might have happened anyway, and we were just lucky enough to be in the right place at the right time. You may be convinced that he made an amazing film, but not even Peli can convince himself of that. I have two questions to ask. First, should a line be drawn somewhere? At one point, low-grade slasher films were considered the bottom of the barrel by the critics, despite the production value these films did indeed have. Ebert is going to bash a film like Friday the 13th, but praise Blair Witch Project and Paranormal Activity, Haunted House Attractions? Second, should we sacrifice filmmaking skill, talent, and aesthetics for a cheap gimmick scare? To the claims that these films are effective, I say, so what? Aren't drugs effective too? Yet they're frowned upon as a shortcut to dealing with our problems. This is exactly what these found footage filmmakers are doing. They're dumbing down the horror audience with their found footage. As drugs bring down the quality of one's life, found footage brings down the standard and ultimately the quality of film. In 1917, Marcel Duchamp got a hold of a urinal, turned it on its side, and signed it R. Mutt. According to Wikipedia, the work, called The Fountain, is regarded by some art historians and theorists of the avant-garde as a major landmark in 20th century art.
What strikes me about the fountain is that although it's a male object in the sense that it's used by men, it's not, of course, in the position it would normally be in a lavatory. And placed as it is, it's got a feminine form, a sort of hip-like shape. And I can't help seeing the elements of it, the plumbing elements, as female.
Really? Once again, I'm scratching my head. Why is a lack of effort something genius? Does this not lower our standards of what we define as art? Art, at least in my world, shouldn't be something only thought-provoking, but something that requires time, effort, creativity, and passion. If it lacks this, then it lacks soul, because essentially, anyone could do what you did. It's time, effort, creativity, and passion that sets our art apart from the others. They demonstrate our commitment towards our creations and their message. Don't be one of those art snobs who thinks writing a name on a urinal is something genius that the layman can't understand. True geniuses put soul into their work, even if the overlying intention is a financial one. Critics can say, it means this or it means that, but to me, it doesn't mean anything if the artist, him or herself, didn't even care about what they were doing, because if they did, they'd put some effort into it.
I've always thought an artist carries a certain amount of emotion into a painting. Is that any kind of an emotional thing for you? No. He's overcome with it. None at all?
The success of Paranormal Activity opened the floodgates for these type of films, both inside and outside of Hollywood. On the shooting of Paranormal Activity 3, Oren Peli states, I was looking at the footage and it looked very professional, and I kept telling him, the cameraman, like, you gotta do a worse job. It really saddens me to read this. Now we're asking professional cameramen to do a bad job? Over a century of cinema, and this is what it has amounted to? Making bad films on purpose to milk a gimmick? He also states in another interview, one of the things I wanted to do was create something that people would say defined horror for their generation, the way after Psycho, people said they would never take another shower. As much as Peli should feel embarrassed and ashamed at his comment comparing his film to Psycho, he's sadly correct in one aspect. Paranormal Activity does reflect modern horror. Effortless and lacking creativity.